Unit 3, Lesson 1, the solar eclipse. As we know that the light travels in straight lines, the sunlight travels in straight lines, or the sun emits heat and light. And this light or the sunlight travels in straight lines as long as there is nothing prevent it, like this activity that we studied in junior 5, the light travels in a straight line. But when anything or when dark object gets in the way of the sunlight, so the shadow formed. The forming of the shadow or the sunlight blocks from these objects, like the shadow of the tree or the shadow of this boy. So the shadow is formed when the dark body is put in front of a source of the light. When any dark object or any opaque object blocks the sunlight, so the shadow is formed. Now we will talk about the solar eclipse. What does it mean by the solar eclipse? Solar eclipse means it's an astronomical phenomenon. It's an astronomical phenomenon happens when the sun and the moon and the earth are nearly on one straight line, like this, nearly on one straight lines. So as we know that this is the earth revolves around the sun. The earth revolves around the sun in oval orbits. And also the moons, they are followers to the planet, followers to the earth. So the moon revolves around the earth. When the earth revolves around the sun and the moon revolves around the earth, when the three sun, moon, and the earth are nearly on one straight line, where the moon in the middle, so the solar eclipse happened. So it's an astronomical phenomenon occurred when the earth and the sun and the moon are nearly on one straight line, where the moon or when the moon in the middle. Okay, so there are three types of the shadow. There are three types of the shadow. Number one, as we said from here, the moon in the middle. The moon in the middle, and the sun, this is the sunlight. Okay, as we see here, there are three types of the shadow. This cone shadow, the cone shadow called umbra shadow. This is the dark inner shadow. This part is called inner shadow, inner dark area. It's called the umbra shadow. In the umbra shadow, the people here who live here we can't see the sunlight, totally the sunlight. So the total solar eclipse happened. The total solar eclipse happened in the umbra shadow. Why? Because the moon seems at the same size of the sun. The moon looks like the same size, in the same size of the moon. So it blocks totally the sunlight. There is no sunlight reach to the earth. So the types of the shadow, number one, the umbra shadow. Umbra shadow, it's a dark inner shadow. This area called dark inner shadow, it's called umbra shadow. In the umbra shadow, the total solar eclipse happened because the moon blocks totally the sunlight. It blocks all the sunlight. There is no sunlight reach to the earth. Okay, so anyone at umbra region, anyone live at umbra region here, can't see the source of the light. Can't see the source of the light. So it forms the total solar eclipse. Number 2, or type number 2 in the shadow, called the penumbra shadow. Penumbra shadow. This is here. This is the sun and the moon and the earth. This cone shadow called umbra shadow. In the umbra shadow happens at the total solar eclipse. Number 2 called penumbra shadow. Penumbra shadow, it's an outer, the green shadow. This is the green color. This area called penumbra. This area called penumbra shadow. In the penumbra shadow, the partial solar eclipse happened because it faint outer shadow. The faint out, not dark, the dark shadow called umbra, but the faint shadow, faint outer shadow called penumbra shadow. In penumbra shadow, the partial solar eclipse happens. So the partially dark regions, as some same light to reach to it. Anyone at penumbra shadow can see a part of the source of the light, can see a part of the sunlight or the sun, and can see the other part. So in penumbra shadow, the partial solar eclipse happens. So again, we have two types of the shadow, umbra and penumbra. In the umbra shadow, the total solar eclipse happens because the moon seems at the same size of the sun. Seems at the same size of the sun, so it blocks totally the sun, the sunlight. But in penumbra shadow, the faint shadow, the partial solar eclipse happens. Anyone lives or at the penumbra shadow can see part of the sunlight and can see the other part. So the partial solar eclipse happens. Type number 3 called the antempra shadow, or the antempra shadow. The antempra shadow happens when the moon comes between the sun and the earth, but in a higher object, a higher orbit. In a higher orbit. As we know that the moon revolves around the earth in oval orbits. So sometimes it close to the earth and sometimes it farther from the earth. When the moon farther from the earth or in a higher orbit from the earth, it revolves around the sun, it revolves around the earth in oval orbits. Okay? When the moon higher orbit, in the higher orbit or farther from the earth, so the cone shadow, this is the umbra shadow, doesn't reach to the earth because the moon farther from the earth. So this shadow doesn't reach to the earth. And another shadow happened or formed. Another cone shadow formed. This shadow is called antempra shadow. So the antempra shadow, when the moon revolves around the earth, but in a higher orbit. This antempra shadow, or in the antempra shadow, it causes an annular solar eclipse, another type of the solar eclipse called annular solar eclipse. Okay, so in the antempra shadow, the annular solar eclipse happens. So we have three types of the shadow, that the types of the solar eclipse depend on these three types of shadow or three types of area. Number 1, umbra shadow. In the umbra shadow, the total solar eclipse happens. In penumbra shadow, the partial solar eclipse happens. But in the antemporal shadow when the moon revolves around the earth, but in a higher orbit or farther from the earth, because it revolves around the earth in oval orbit. So the annular solar eclipse happens. So when the moon, again, when the moon comes between the earth and the sun, but nearer to the earth, the moon nearer to the earth. So there are two types of shadow. Number one, ampra and penumbra. Number one, the moon blocks the sunlight totally in ampra shadow, so it forming the total solar eclipse. Number two, the moon blocks the sunlight partially, so the partial solar eclipse happen in penumbra shadow. So this is the partial solar eclipse. The sun appears like this, but the total solar eclipse, the moon blocks totally the solar eclipse, the sunlight blocks totally the sunlight, so it happens total solar eclipse. When the moon comes between the earth and the sun, but the moon in farther from the earth or in a higher orbit from the earth, so it appears smaller than the sun. Its size is smaller than the sun. So the moon causes an annular solar eclipse at the area of antemporal area shadow, or in the antemporal shadow, the moon in antemporal, the sunlight looks like this picture. It looks like a ring, lightened ring. So this is called the annular solar eclipse. So the type of the solar eclipse, it changes according to the distance between the moon and the earth. Is the moon close to the earth or farther from the earth? If the moon closer to the earth, so the total solar eclipse and partial solar eclipse happen. But if the moon farther from the earth, so the annular solar eclipse happens. So we have three types of the solar eclipse: total, partial, and annular. Depend on the distance between the moon and the earth, and depend on the shadow. Total in ampra shadow, partial in penumbra shadow, annular solar eclipse in antemporal shadow. So read the types of the solar eclipse, the three types of the solar eclipse. Number one, the total solar eclipse. What is the meaning of the total solar eclipse? It's the type of the solar eclipse that is forming in ampra shadow, forming in the ampra shadow of the moon. So we can see the sunlight, we can see completely the sunlight like this. We can see the sunlight. But partial solar eclipse happen in semi-shadow, in the semi-shadow area that is called the penumbra shadow. So we can see part of the sunlight like this. We can see part of the sunlight in penumbra shadow like this. But annular solar eclipse, it's the type of the solar eclipse that is forming when the moon in a higher orbit, when the moon revolves around the earth in a higher orbit farther from the earth, so its cone shadow doesn't reach to the earth. So the antemporal shadow happen or forming. So the sun appears as a lighted ring, like this. So this is called annular solar eclipse. So the three types of the solar eclipse depend on the shadow, ampra So the total happened in the emperor, partial happened in penumbra, annular solar eclipse happened when the moon in a higher orbit from the earth or in antempora shadow, so the sun appears or look like a lighted ring. The solar eclipse phenomenon doesn't last for more than 7 minutes. Its time doesn't last for 7 minutes and few seconds or 40 seconds. So the duration or the time of the solar eclipse, 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Okay. Last part in this lesson, safety precautions on observing the solar eclipse. As we know that we must not look directly to the sunlight in ordinary days. At the ordinary days, we shouldn't or we mustn't look directly to the sunlight because the sunlight emits harmful rays. The sunlight emits harmful rays. These harmful rays like ultraviolet rays and infrared rays, radio waves, gamma rays, it emits harmful rays. But the ultraviolet and infrared rays may cause blindness because they affect the eye retina. They affect the eye retina, so it may cause blindness. We can't see anything because these rays, they are harmful rays. So the doctors advise us to use a special glass or protective glasses to observe the solar eclipse because the outer solar corona emits ultraviolet rays and infrared rays that affect the eye retina and may cause blindness. So the doctors advise us to use special glasses or protective glasses to observe the solar eclipse because at the ordinary days the sun emits the harmful rays like ultraviolet and infrared, and these rays may cause blindness within a few minutes. So we must wear a special glasses like this to observe the solar eclipse. Okay. And junior 6, we have homework. Wait for me. On the solar eclipse. We have homework week worksheet number 10. Worksheet number 10 on the solar eclipse. The solar eclipse and worksheet number 10. And weekend sheet number 8. Weekend sheet number 8 about the solar eclipse also. Okay, the next session we will talk about the type number 2 of the eclipses, the lunar eclipses. Okay, thank you, junior 6. Goodbye.